September 23, 1945. Victory over Japan had been declared weeks earlier, and across Canada, communities prepared to welcome home their soldiers. In the industrial city of Kitchener, Ontario, something entirely unexpected was happening. A transport truck carrying 32 German women prisoners of war rolled through streets lined with homes flying Canadian flags, past factories that had spent the war years producing military equipment, and finally through the gates of a hastily converted detention facility on the city's eastern edge. These women weren't supposed to exist in Canadian consciousness. Unlike the thousands of German and Italian male prisoners who had labored on farms and in lumber camps across the country, female prisoners of war were a rarity that military planners had never anticipated. Yet here they were, members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final chaotic weeks of the European theater, now facing an uncertain future, in a country many of them had never heard of before their capture. Captain Ilse Brennan stood waiting as the transport vehicle came to a stop in the compound yard. Her Austrian-Canadian heritage made her uniquely qualified for this unusual assignment, though nothing in her military training had prepared her for the responsibility of overseeing 36 enemy women in a city that still bore the scars of anti-German sentiment from the previous war. Kitchener itself had been renamed from Berlin during the First World War, a change that reflected the deep suspicion toward anything Germanic. Now, nearly 30 years later, those old wounds had barely healed before new ones were inflicted. As the women descended from the truck, Captain Brennan observed them with a practiced eye. They ranged in age from barely 20 to mid-30s, wearing a mixture of tattered auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothing acquired during their long journey from European detention centers. Their faces showed exhaustion, uncertainty, and something else she couldn't quite name. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of resigned dignity that suggested these women had already endured more than most people would face in a lifetime. Among them, 24-year-old Anneliese Vogel stood out, not because of any physical distinction, but because of the way the other women seemed to orient themselves around her. She had been a radio operator stationed in Hamburg, intercepting Allied communications until British forces overran her position in April. Now she carried only a small canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a wooden comb, and a photograph of her family that she had managed to keep hidden through multiple interrogations and transfers. The photograph showed her parents and younger brother standing in front of their modest home, taken in the summer of 1941, when the world still made sense. Captain Brennan stepped forward to address the new arrivals in German, her Austrian accent softening the formal military phrases. The women listened in silence, their expressions revealing nothing. But Lise noticed something that made her breath catch slightly. Behind the captain, painted on the administrative building, were the words, "Welcome to Kitchener," in both English and German. It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing, yet it was the first gesture of acknowledgement in their own language that any of them had seen since becoming prisoners. The compound that would house the German women was unlike the sprawling prisoner of war camps that held thousands of male captives across Canada. This facility occupied a former textile warehouse, converted hastily with wooden partitions creating dormitory spaces, a common area, and administrative offices. The women were assigned to bunks in groups of 8, an arrangement that felt simultaneously intimate and isolating. Lise found herself sharing space with Hedwig Kraus, a medical assistant from Munich whose quiet competence had already made her invaluable during their transport, and Waltraud Meyer, a former secretary who spoke rarely but observed everything with sharp, intelligent eyes. As they settled into their assigned areas, the women began to notice peculiarities about their surroundings that didn't match their expectations of enemy territory. The guards who patrolled the compound spoke among themselves in a mixture of English and German. Street signs visible beyond the fence bore German names alongside English translations. Even the architecture of nearby homes reflected a distinctly European influence that could have been transplanted from the Rhineland or Bavaria. It created a strange cognitive dissonance, being imprisoned in a place that felt disconcertingly familiar. Sergeant Otto Reinhardt introduced himself to the prisoners during their first evening meal. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had immigrated to Canada in 1928, leaving Germany long before the Nazi Party's rise to power. His German carried the formal precision of someone who had learned it as his mother tongue but hadn't spoken it regularly in years. He explained the camp rules with business-like efficiency, neither friendly nor hostile, treating the women as he might any group requiring supervision and structure. Private Thomas Pearson, by contrast, seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation. He was barely 21, a farm boy from rural Ontario who had joined the military too late to see combat, but early enough to be assigned duties he never anticipated. He spoke no German and relied entirely on Sergeant Reinhardt for communication with the prisoners. Lees noticed how he avoided making eye contact with any of them, as if their presence personally embarrassed him or challenged something he believed about the war and who belonged on which side. The first meal served to the prisoners was simple but adequate: bread, cheese, soup made from vegetables and barley, weak tea. After months of irregular rations during their transfers through various military channels, the predictability of the portions felt almost luxurious. The women ate in silence, years of military discipline keeping them from the kind of conversation that might reveal too much emotion or vulnerability. But Lees caught fragments of whispered exchanges in the common area afterward. Some women speculated about how long they would remain here. Others wondered aloud whether their families knew where they were, or even if they were alive. A few simply stared at the walls, processing the reality that this strange, familiar-feeling place might be their home for an indefinite future. October arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Lees ache for Hamburg. The autumn air in Kitchener carried the same quality of light, the same smell of wood smoke and dying leaves that had marked the changing seasons of her childhood. It was a cruel reminder that geography meant nothing when longing for home. The women had settled into routines dictated by camp regulations: morning roll call, work assignments in the laundry or kitchen, afternoon recreation periods, evening meals followed by mandatory quiet hours. The structure provided comfort in its predictability, even as it underscored their status as captives rather than guests. The work assignments revealed unexpected dynamics. Haiti Krause had been assigned to assist the camp's medical officer, a gruff older doctor named Patterson, who spoke no German, but communicated through gestures and the universal language of medical procedures. Within days, he began relying on her competence, trusting her to prepare supplies and assist with minor treatments. Trudy Meyer worked in the administrative office, her neat handwriting and attention to detail making her invaluable for record-keeping. Lees found herself assigned to the kitchen, peeling vegetables alongside 2 other prisoners and under the supervision of a German-Canadian cook named Mrs. Hoffman. Mrs. Hoffman was a stout woman in her 60s who had immigrated to Canada before the First World War. She ran her kitchen with Germanic efficiency but showed unexpected moments of kindness. When she noticed Lees struggling with an unfamiliar Canadian potato peeler, she demonstrated the technique without comment, then moved on as if the small instruction meant nothing. But to Lees, it was the first neutral interaction she had experienced in months, neither hostile nor performatively kind, simply one person showing another how to accomplish a task. Private Pearson had been assigned as one of the regular guards for the women's compound. His initial discomfort had not faded, but it had transformed into something like careful curiosity. He watched the women during recreation periods, observing how they organized themselves, how they maintained their appearance despite limited resources, how they seemed to create small rituals of normalcy within the constraints of captivity. One afternoon, Lees noticed him listening intently as several women sang softly, while mending their clothes, old folk songs from different regions of Germany that somehow harmonized despite their varied origins. The weather grew colder, and Captain Brennan authorized the distribution of warmer clothing from military surplus. The women received Canadian Army sweaters, thick socks, and wool blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs and storage. Wearing these items felt like another small surrender, another layer of their German identity being replaced by something foreign and imposed. Yet the warmth was undeniable, practical, necessary. Lise pulled on her issued sweater and felt simultaneously grateful and resentful, a combination of emotions that seemed to characterize everything about her current existence in this strange place that felt too much like home to be truly foreign. The first real conversation between captor and captive happened by accident on a gray morning in mid-October. Lise was carrying a basket of laundry across the compound when she stumbled on uneven ground, spilling clean linens into the dirt. She cursed in German, a sharp word of frustration that her mother would have scolded her for using. From behind her, she heard an unexpected sound, laughter. She turned to find Sergeant Reinhardt watching her, his weathered face showing the first genuine amusement she had seen from any of the guards. "My wife uses that exact word when she burns the bread," he said in German, his tone conversational rather than mocking. Lise stared at him, unsure how to respond. The rules of their relationship had been clear. Guards commanded, prisoners obeyed, and personal exchanges were discouraged. Yet here was this man, acknowledging her humanity through shared language and shared domestic frustration. She bent to retrieve the soiled linens, and without being asked, Sergeant Reinhardt helped her gather them, his movements efficient and unself-conscious. "You're from Hamburg?" he asked as they worked. Lise nodded, still wary. "I have a cousin there. Had a cousin. I don't know any more what happened to family after the war." There was no accusation in his voice, just statement of fact. The war had severed connections for everyone, regardless of which side they had served. Lise found herself telling him about her neighborhood, the streets near the harbor where she had grown up. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he mentioned that his cousin had lived near the same district. The coincidence was likely meaningless, but it created a small thread of connection between them. Word of Sergeant Reinhardt's willingness to speak German spread quietly among the prisoners. Some women began attempting basic conversations with him during his patrol rounds, asking questions about the city, about Canadian customs, about things that had nothing to do with their imprisonment, but everything to do with understanding the place where they now existed. He answered when he could, ignored questions that seemed designed to test boundaries, and maintained his authority without resorting to harshness. It was a delicate balance that both sides learned to navigate. Captain Brennan noticed the shift in dynamics, but chose not to interfere. She had her own complicated relationship with language and identity, having grown up speaking German at home while being thoroughly Canadian in public. She understood that allowing these small human connections might prevent larger problems down the line. Isolated, resentful prisoners caused trouble. Prisoners who felt seen as individuals, even in captivity, were easier to manage. It was practical reasoning, but she also recognized something else at work, something less calculated and more hopeful about what might be possible when enemies shared more than just a common conflict. The discovery happened during a routine walk to the compound's perimeter fence. Lise and 3 other women had been given permission for supervised outdoor exercise, a privilege granted after 6 weeks of model behavior. Private Pearson accompanied them, maintaining his usual careful distance. As they walked along the fence line, voices drifted across from the neighboring street where children played in a schoolyard. The children were singing, their high voices carrying clearly in the autumn air. Lise stopped walking, her breath catching in recognition. They were singing Alle Vögel sind schon da, a German spring song about birds returning home. The melody was identical to what Lise had learned as a child, but the children sang it in German, their pronunciation careful and clear. She turned to Haiti, who had also stopped, her face showing the same confusion and wonder. How could Canadian children, children of their enemies, know German folk songs? How could they sing them with such familiarity, as if these melodies belonged to them as much as they belonged to anyone from Germany? Private Pearson noticed their reaction and, through halting gestures and his limited vocabulary, tried to explain. Captain Brennan was summoned when he couldn't make himself understood. She arrived and addressed the women in German, her expression showing that she had anticipated this moment would come eventually. Kitchener has a large German population, she explained, many families who immigrated decades ago. They maintained their language, their traditions, their songs. What you're hearing is not borrowed or stolen. It's theirs too. They brought it with them when they came to build new lives. The explanation raised more questions than it answered. Lise had been taught that German culture was uniquely German, tied to the soil and blood of the homeland, yet here were people who had left Germany, who had chosen Canada, and they had carried these songs across an ocean and kept them alive in a new land. It challenged something fundamental about what she thought it meant to be German, about whether identity could be portable, whether traditions could belong to more than one place simultaneously. That evening, the women gathered in their common area and talked late into the night. Some found the idea of German culture thriving in Canada reassuring, evidence that pieces of home existed even in this foreign place. Others felt it as a kind of betrayal, as if these immigrants had abandoned their true country and cheapened their heritage by sharing it with outsiders. Trudy Meyer, usually quiet, spoke with unexpected passion. Maybe they didn't abandon Germany. Maybe they took Germany with them and made it something new, something that could exist without needing enemies or conquest or purity. Her words hung in the air, challenging and uncomfortable. Lise thought about the children singing in the schoolyard, how their voices had sounded joyful and unself-conscious, how they sang German songs while playing Canadian games in a country that had just fought against Germany. The contradiction should have been impossible, yet she had heard it with her own ears. It suggested possibilities she wasn't ready to name, futures that seemed both frightening and strangely hopeful in ways she couldn't yet articulate to herself or anyone else around her. October 28th arrived with morning frost coating the compound windows in delicate patterns. Captain Brennan called an unusual assembly for all prisoners, her expression revealing nothing about the purpose of the gathering. The women filed into the common area with the mixture of anxiety and resignation that characterized all official announcements. Lise positioned herself where she could see the captain's face clearly, searching for clues about what news was coming. Good news and bad news often wore similar expressions on the faces of those delivering them. Captain Brennan waited until everyone had settled before speaking in German. I have received authorization from military command to inform you of an event taking place in Kitchener next week. The city holds an annual Oktoberfest celebration, a tradition maintained by the German-Canadian community for over 40 years. This year, to mark the end of the war and the beginning of peace, the organizers have invited representatives from this facility to attend as observers. The silence that followed was absolute. The women stared at Captain Brennan as if she had spoken in an incomprehensible language. Haiti found her voice first. They celebrate Oktoberfest? Here, in Canada? The disbelief in her tone reflected what everyone was thinking. Oktoberfest was quintessentially German, tied to Munich and Bavarian traditions. The idea that Canadians, people whose country had just finished fighting Germany, would celebrate a German festival seemed impossible. Captain Brennan nodded, her expression softening slightly. The German community here maintained their traditions even during both wars. It wasn't always easy or popular, but they persisted. They see it as part of their heritage, not as a political statement. The announcement sparked immediate debate among the prisoners. Some women wanted no part of attending, viewing it as a humiliation or a trap. Others were desperately curious, hungry for any connection to the culture they had been separated from for so long. Lise felt torn between competing reactions. Part of her wanted to witness this impossible thing, to see how German traditions could exist in a country that had been Germany's enemy. Another part feared what it might reveal about everything she thought she understood about identity and belonging and home. Captain Brennan explained the conditions. Only 12 women would be permitted to attend, selected based on behavior and the judgment of camp staff. They would be escorted by guards at all times and would attend for exactly 3 hours during the festival's opening day. Any inappropriate behavior would result in immediate return to the compound and loss of privileges. For all prisoners, the rules were clear and strict, but beneath them lay an extraordinary gesture, an acknowledgement that these women were more than just enemy prisoners, that they had some claim to the cultural traditions being celebrated. Lise made her decision before she fully understood why. She approached Captain Brennan after the assembly and requested to be considered for the group. The captain studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I expected you would ask. You'll go. Use the opportunity wisely." Lise returned to her bunk, wondering what using the opportunity wisely might mean and whether she would recognize wisdom when she encountered it in the strange context of watching Canadians celebrate being German. November 4th, 1945. The 12 selected women dressed in their cleanest available clothing, a mixture of issued garments and carefully mended personal items that represented their best attempt at dignity. Lisa wore a plain gray skirt and a borrowed cardigan, her hair pinned back in a style that felt more appropriate for a church service than a festival. None of them knew what to expect, and the uncertainty manifested in nervous silence as they boarded the transport truck. Sergeant Reinhardt and Private Pearson would serve as their escorts, along with Captain Brennan, who had changed from her uniform into civilian clothing. The festival was held in Kitchener's Victoria Park, a sprawling green space transformed by temporary structures, banners, and crowds that seemed impossibly large after weeks of seeing only the same few dozen faces. As the women descended from the truck at the park's edge, the sounds hit them first. Accordion music, laughter, the clink of glasses, voices speaking German with Canadian accents that sounded both familiar and foreign. Then came the smells, roasting meat, fresh bread, beer, and autumn leaves. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault that made several women stop walking entirely, simply trying to process what they were experiencing. Captain Brennan guided them toward the main pavilion where the celebration centered. Long tables filled the space, packed with people of all ages dressed in everything from traditional Bavarian costume to ordinary Canadian clothing. On a raised platform, a band played traditional German folk music with enthusiastic, if not entirely precise, execution. Banners proclaimed "Willkommen" alongside Canadian flags, a visual representation of the dual identity that seemed to characterize everything about this event. The German women stood at the edge of the pavilion, conspicuous in their uncertainty and their obvious status as outsiders, despite the familiar cultural trappings surrounding them. An elderly woman approached their group, her face creased with age, but her eyes bright with curiosity. She addressed them in German, her dialect distinctly Bavarian. "You're the women from the camp, yes? Welcome. I'm Frau Schmidt. My husband and I came here in 1923. She spoke as if their presence required no special acknowledgement, as if German women watching Germans celebrate Germanness in Canada was the most natural thing imaginable. She gestured toward the tables. "Come, sit. You must be hungry. We have bratwurst, sauerkraut, potato salad, just like home." Hetty glanced at Captain Brennan, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. The captain nodded, and slowly, hesitantly, the women moved toward the indicated table. As they sat, other festival-goers made room for them, some offering greetings in German, others in English, a few in both languages interchangeably. Plates of food appeared before them, served by volunteers who seemed genuinely pleased to have them present. Lise stared at the bratwurst on her plate, traditional food served by people who had left Germany decades ago, now welcoming German prisoners to share in traditions that somehow belong to everyone and no one exclusively. Nothing about this moment matched anything she had been taught about enemies, about loyalty, about what it meant to be German in a world at war. The beer was weaker than what Lise remembered from Germany, and the potato salad had a sweetness that seemed distinctly North American, but the essential character of the food remained recognizable. The women ate slowly, hyper-aware of being watched, even as the festival continued around them with boisterous energy. Children ran between tables, chasing each other in games that transcended language. Older men argued about proper brewing techniques in German, peppered with English words that had no German equivalents. Women in dirndls served food with practiced efficiency, their costumes somehow both authentic and performative, honoring tradition while adapting it to new circumstances. The music shifted, and the band began playing a traditional Schuhplattler, a Bavarian folk dance that required energetic stomping and slapping of thighs and shoes. Several couples took to the cleared area before the stage, executing the complex steps with varying degrees of skill. Lise watched, mesmerized by the sight of Canadians performing a dance she had only seen once at a festival in Munich before the war. They performed it with joy rather than precision, clearly valuing participation over perfection, and the crowd encouraged them with clapping and laughter that held no mockery, only appreciation for the attempt. Private Pearson appeared beside their table, looking uncomfortable but determined. Through gestures and broken phrases, he tried to communicate something to Lisa. Sergeant Reinhardt intervened, translating. "He's asking if you would like to dance. Not the folk dance, but when they play a waltz. He says his grandmother taught him, and he thinks it might be nice for you to dance to familiar music." The request was so unexpected, so genuine in its awkwardness, that Lise found herself nodding before she could consider the implications. When the band transitioned to a traditional waltz, Private Pearson offered his hand with the formal stiffness of someone performing an action he had rehearsed mentally but never executed in reality. Lise stood, aware of every eye in their group watching, and allowed him to lead her to the dance area. His grandmother had indeed taught him well. His steps were correct, if somewhat mechanical. They moved through the dance without speaking, the music filling the silence between them. Around them, other couples waltzed, old and young, German Canadians, and what appeared to be neighbors of other backgrounds who had simply joined the celebration. As they danced, Lisa found herself crying, tears sliding down her cheeks despite her attempts to maintain composure. Private Pearson noticed but said nothing, simply continuing the dance with gentle firmness. The tears weren't from sadness, exactly, nor from joy, but from something more complicated. She was dancing a German waltz with a Canadian soldier in a Canadian city at a German festival, and none of it made sense according to everything she had been taught about the world. The contradiction should have been impossible to reconcile, yet here she was, moving through them physically, her body understanding something her mind still struggled to accept about the strange possibilities that existed when enemies chose music over hatred. The waltz ended, and Lise returned to her seat, aware that something had shifted within her that she couldn't name. The other women watched her with expressions ranging from disapproval to envy, their own rigid boundaries challenged by her participation. Before anyone could comment, the band leader stepped to the microphone and announced in German that they would take requests from the audience. Hands shot up throughout the pavilion, people calling out titles of folk songs and traditional melodies that clearly held personal meaning for them. An older man requested Die Gedanken sind frei, a song about freedom of thought. The band played it with reverence, and voices throughout the pavilion joined in, singing words about how thoughts cannot be imprisoned, how the mind remains free even when the body is constrained. Lise felt the irony pierce through her. These people sang about freedom while she sat among them as a prisoner, yet their ancestors had chosen to leave Germany to find the very freedom the song described. The layers of meaning made her dizzy. Then Frau Schmidt, the elderly woman who had first welcomed them, approached their table again. She spoke directly to Hetty, whose medical work had been mentioned in earlier conversation. "Do you know Guter Mond, du gehst so stille?" It was a lullaby, a gentle song about the moon watching over sleeping children. Hetty nodded, her throat visibly tightening with emotion. "My mother sang it to me every night," Frau Schmidt continued, "in Munich, before we left. I sang it to my children here in Canada. They sang it to their children, the same song across an ocean, across years." The band began playing the melody, and Frau Schmidt started singing in a wavering but clear voice. Other voices joined hers, older women mostly, singing the lullaby their mothers and grandmothers had taught them. Without planning to, without permission, Hetty began singing too. Her voice was stronger than Frau Schmidt's, trained from years in church choirs. Beside her, Trudy joined in, then 2 other prisoners. Their voices blended with the Canadian-German voices around them, creating harmony that erased any distinction between who had stayed and who had left, who had fought and who had fled. Lise listened rather than sang, watching the faces around her. Some people had tears streaming down their cheeks, moved by memories the song evoked. Others smiled with simple pleasure at hearing familiar words in a communal setting. The children in the pavilion had stopped running, drawn to the unusually quiet moment. Some of them sang along, learning words in a language many of them barely spoke anymore, but recognizing the melody that connected them to ancestors they had never met. When the song ended, silence held for a moment before applause erupted. Captain Brennan, standing at the edge of the pavilion, wiped her eyes discreetly. She had understood something that military training never taught, that culture could be both a bridge and a weapon, depending on who wielded it and for what purpose. Today it was building a bridge, fragile and temporary, but real nonetheless, in ways that mattered beyond politics or war. The return to the compound that evening felt like awakening from a dream into harsh reality. The women who had attended the festival were quiet, processing what they had experienced. Those who had remained behind asked questions that revealed their curiosity, despite their earlier refusals to participate. Lise went to her bunk exhausted, emotionally drained by the contradictions she had navigated throughout the day. She fell asleep quickly, but woke before dawn, unable to return to rest. In the common area, she found Trudy sitting alone with a newspaper. It was a week-old edition of a Toronto paper that someone had left in the camp's small library. The front page showed photographs that made Lisa's stomach clench, images from the Nuremberg trials that had begun in late October. Detailed testimonies about concentration camps, about systematic murder, about atrocities carried out in Germany's name. The festival's joy felt obscene in retrospect, a celebration of German culture while German crimes were being documented for history's judgment. Trudy looked up as Lise approached. "I've been reading all night. All of it. Every article about the trials, about what they found when camps were liberated. I didn't know. Did you know?" Her voice carried desperation, a need to believe that their ignorance had been genuine rather than willful. Lise sat beside her, taking the newspaper with trembling hands. She read accounts of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, names that meant nothing to her, but which the articles described with horrifying specificity. By morning, other women had gathered around the newspaper. Some read in silence, faces draining of color. Others refused to look, insisting the reports must be Allied propaganda designed to justify the war's destruction. But most simply read with growing horror, confronting the possibility that they had served a regime capable of industrial-scale murder. The Auxiliary Corps had been non-combatant, focused on communications and logistics, but those very systems had supported the machinery that enabled the camps to function. Captain Brennan found them there at morning roll call, clustered around the newspaper in various states of distress. She didn't reprimand them for missing the official assembly time. Instead, she pulled up a chair and sat with them, letting them ask questions in German, in English, in whatever words they could find for the unfindable. "Is it true?" Hetty asked, her medical training making her focus on the documented numbers, the calculations of death that seemed to exceed human comprehension. "Is all of it true?" "Yes," Captain Brennan answered simply. "The trials are presenting evidence, documents, testimony from survivors and perpetrators. It's all being recorded, verified by multiple sources. What you're reading represents only a fraction of what's being revealed." The weight of that confirmation settled over the women like physical pressure. Yesterday they had danced to German music, eaten German food, celebrated German traditions. Today they learned what else Germany had created, what other systems had operated while they filed reports and transmitted messages and believed they were serving their country's defense. The mood in the compound shifted dramatically in the days following the newspaper discovery. The women who had attended Oktoberfest now felt conflicted about having participated as if enjoying German. Culture constituted an endorsement of German crimes. Some stopped speaking German entirely, forcing themselves to communicate only in broken English as a form of self-imposed penance. Others became withdrawn, refusing to participate in work assignments or social interactions, their depression visible in slumped shoulders and vacant stares that worried the camp's medical staff. Lise found herself unable to reconcile the two images of Germany that now existed in her mind. There was the Germany of folk songs and traditional dances, of her mother's kitchen and Sunday church services, of neighbors helping neighbors and children playing in streets. Then there was the Germany of the camps, of systematic murder disguised as efficiency, of ordinary people committing extraordinary evil. Both were real. Both had existed simultaneously. How could the same country that produced beautiful music also produce such horror? Sergeant Reinhardt noticed the change during his rounds. The women who had previously attempted conversations with him now avoided eye contact. When he spoke German, some physically flinched, as if the language itself had become contaminated. He mentioned his concerns to Captain Brennan, who called a mandatory assembly. She stood before the assembled prisoners with the newspaper in her hands, its photographs visible to everyone. Her words were careful, chosen for their precision rather than their comfort. What you've learned about your country's crimes doesn't erase your personal humanity. You are responsible for your own actions, not for crimes you didn't commit and didn't know about. But you are responsible for what you choose to do with this knowledge now. She paused, letting her words settle. The German Canadians who celebrated Oktoberfest left Germany before the Nazis came to power. They maintained their culture because it belonged to them, not to any political party or regime. Culture and crime are not the same thing. Her words provided some framework for thinking about the impossible situation, but they didn't resolve the emotional turmoil. Hetty approached the captain privately after the assembly, her face showing the internal struggle she was experiencing. "How can I be proud of being German after learning this? How can any of us?" Captain Brennan considered the question seriously before responding. "Maybe being German going forward means bearing witness to what happened and ensuring it never happens again. Maybe it means separating heritage from hatred." That night, the women gathered in their common area without prompting from guards or officials. They talked late into darkness, their conversation ranging from defensive denial to angry self-recrimination to genuine attempts at understanding. Lise listened more than she spoke, absorbing the different reactions and recognizing that there was no single correct way to process this knowledge. Each woman had to find her own path through the moral wilderness that had opened. Before them, her own way of being German in a world that now knew what Germany had done. November brought the first letters from Germany, packages of mail that had been delayed for months, working through military postal systems. Not every woman received correspondence. The addresses many had provided were in cities that no longer existed in recognizable form, neighborhoods obliterated by bombing or burned in the final battles. But for those who did receive letters, the news was universally devastating. Lisa's letter came from a neighbor in Hamburg, not from her family. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and poor quality. The neighbor wrote that Lisa's apartment building had been destroyed in the July 1943 firestorm that had killed an estimated 40,000 people. Her parents and younger brother were among the dead. The neighbor had only survived by fleeing to the countryside months earlier. She had heard about Lisa's capture through networks of displaced persons and wanted her to know what had happened. The letter ended with a plea. "Don't come back. There's nothing here but ghosts and rubble. Build a life somewhere else." Lise read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. She had intellectually understood that her family might be dead, but some part of her had continued believing they were simply unreachable, that eventually communication would be restored. Now that possibility was gone, replaced by the certainty that she was alone, untethered from the people and place that had defined her identity for 24 years. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her small bag next to the photograph that now showed only dead faces. Hetty's letter came from Munich, from a cousin who had survived the American occupation. The news was less catastrophic but equally bleak. Her family's home was intact, but had been requisitioned by occupation forces. Her father had died of pneumonia during the final winter of the war. Her mother and sister were living in 2 rooms of their former home, sharing space with another displaced family. They had barely enough food to survive. The cousin wrote, "If you can stay away, do. Coming back means one more mouth to feed when there isn't enough for those already here." Throughout the compound, similar scenes repeated. Women reading letters with tears streaming down faces. Others sitting in numb silence, processing news of deaths, destruction, displacement. The mail that should have provided connection to home instead severed many of the remaining emotional ties these women had to Germany. The country they remembered no longer existed. The people they loved were dead, or scattered, or surviving in circumstances that made returning to help them seem like adding burden rather than providing support. The moral clarity about what they should do, where they belonged, evaporated in the face of these brutal facts. Captain Brennan read the summary reports of the mail's contents and understood that she was witnessing a crucial turning point. These women now faced a choice not between captivity and freedom, but between impossible futures. Return to devastation and serve as additional burdens on survivors, or remain among former enemies and attempt to build entirely new lives. Neither option offered comfort, only different versions of exile and loss that would shape whatever futures they managed to construct from the ruins of their pasts. December brought official notification that repatriation procedures would begin in January. The Canadian government, eager to process the unusual situation of female German prisoners, had arranged transport through displaced persons camps in Europe. From there, the women would be released to make their way to whatever remained of their homes. Captain Brennan called an assembly to explain the timeline and procedures, expecting relief or at least resigned acceptance. What she got instead was silence that felt heavy with unspoken questions. After the assembly, Lise requested a private meeting. In Captain Brennan's office, surrounded by military paperwork and maps showing occupied Germany, she spoke carefully in English that had improved dramatically over the past months. "Captain, what would happen if some of us didn't want to be repatriated immediately?" The question hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Captain Brennan leaned back in her chair, studying Lisa's face for signs of what motivated the question: desperation, strategy, genuine uncertainty about the future. "Why would you want to stay?" she asked, her tone neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Lise struggled to articulate thoughts that had been forming since reading her neighbor's letter, since learning her family was gone, since dancing at Oktoberfest and discovering that German culture could exist without German soil. Because going back means returning to nothing. No family, no home, no work. Just being another burden on people already struggling to survive. Here, at least, there's structure, possibility, I don't know what exactly, but something more than rubble and ghosts. Captain Brennan was quiet for a long moment. You understand that staying would mean you're no longer a prisoner of war. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation. If you stayed, it would be as something else. A displaced person, perhaps, an immigrant applicant. The legal status would be complicated, and there's no guarantee the government would allow it. Lise nodded, having already considered these complications. I understand, but I wanted to know if it was even possible before discussing it with others who might feel the same way. The captain made no promises, but she agreed to make inquiries with her superiors. Within days, word of Lisa's question had spread through the compound. Some women were horrified by the idea of choosing to remain among their former enemies. Others admitted they had been thinking similar thoughts, but hadn't dared voice them. The compound divided along invisible lines, those who saw returning to Germany as duty regardless of circumstances, and those who saw remaining in Canada as the only practical path forward, given what they had learned about conditions at home. Haiti and Trudy both approached Lise separately, each confessing they had been wrestling with the same questions. Haiti's medical skills were needed in Germany, but her letter from Munich had made clear that she would be working without proper supplies or support, treating patients in ruins while barely surviving herself. In Canada, she might continue developing skills that could eventually be used to help rebuild, but from a position of strength rather than desperation. The moral calculus was impossible to balance. Christmas arrived with decorations that the German-Canadian community donated to the compound, paper chains, a small evergreen tree, handmade ornaments that looked like they had been created by children. The gesture was both kind and painful, a reminder that celebration existed even in the shadow of everything the women had learned about their homeland's crimes. Captain Brennan authorized a modest Christmas Eve gathering, allowing the prisoners to prepare traditional foods using donated ingredients from local German families who had heard about their situation. The women worked together in the kitchen, preparing dishes from memory and nostalgia. Stollen with limited dried fruit, Lebkuchen cookies made with ingredients that weren't quite right, but close enough to evoke memory. Potato salad that had somehow become part of their communal identity, despite its variations from region to region. As they cooked, they sang quietly the same Christmas carols they had learned as children, the same songs the Kitchener community had maintained across decades of immigration and adaptation. Private Pearson appeared during the preparations, carrying a box of baking supplies his mother had sent. He presented them awkwardly to Lise, explaining through Sergeant Reinhardt that his mother had heard about the Christmas gathering and wanted to contribute. The box contained real vanilla extract, precious sugar, butter that must have cost significant ration points. The extravagance of the gesture made Lisa's eyes water. This woman, this Canadian mother, had sacrificed rationed goods to help enemy prisoners celebrate a holiday that marked peace and goodwill. The Christmas Eve meal was eaten in near silence, each woman lost in memories of past celebrations with families now dead or unreachable. But after the meal, something unexpected happened. Frau Schmidt arrived at the compound with a delegation from the Kitchener German-Canadian community. They brought small gifts, hand-knitted scarves, used books in German, packets of letters from local families who had heard about the women's situations and wanted to offer support or sponsorship for those who might choose to remain in Canada. Captain Brennan had authorized the visit, but hadn't anticipated the emotional impact. The local German Canadians spoke to the prisoners as equals, sharing their own stories of leaving Germany, of maintaining culture while building new identities, of the difficulties and rewards of starting over in a foreign land that became home through choice rather than birth. They offered practical advice about immigration procedures, about finding work, about communities throughout Canada where German skills and language were valued rather than scorned. Lise accepted a letter from Mrs. Helga Baumann, a teacher who offered to sponsor her immigration application if she chose to remain. The letter outlined possibilities: work as a translator, English classes, a room in the Bauman home until she could afford independent housing. It was more concrete than anything waiting for her in Hamburg, more hopeful than the rubble and rationing her neighbor had described. Reading it felt like betrayal and survival simultaneously, like choosing life over loyalty to a country that had destroyed itself and taken her family with it. January 1946 arrived with brutal cold and a deadline. The repatriation transport was scheduled for January 15th. Women who wished to return to Germany needed to confirm their intentions by January 8th. Those who wanted to explore remaining in Canada needed to submit formal applications for displaced person status, applications that required Canadian sponsors willing to vouch for them and provide initial support. The bureaucratic requirements made the choice starkly real, transformed abstract possibilities into concrete paperwork that would determine the rest of their lives. Lisa submitted her application on January 2nd, sponsored by Mrs. Bauman. Hetty followed the next day, her application supported by Dr. Patterson, who had been so impressed with her medical work that he offered to supervise her continued training. Trudy's application came from a local business owner who needed someone with her administrative skills and attention to detail. By January 5th, 11 women total had submitted applications, each supported by Canadian sponsors who saw potential rather than enemy nationality, who chose to offer second chances despite recent history. The women who chose repatriation viewed these applications with mixed emotions. Some were supportive, recognizing that circumstances differed for each person and that survival sometimes required difficult choices. Others felt betrayed, as if choosing to remain in Canada constituted rejection of German identity itself, a final surrender to enemy corruption. The tension created divisions that hadn't existed before. Women who had supported each other through months of captivity, now unable to speak without anger or judgment coloring their words. Captain Brennan worked tirelessly to process both groups fairly. She arranged for the Canadian applications to be expedited, while ensuring that those choosing repatriation received proper documentation and transport arrangements. She met individually with women on both sides, listening to their reasoning, their fears, their hopes. She never tried to influence their decisions, understanding that each woman had to make this choice herself and live with its consequences for the remainder of her life. On January 7th, the day before the deadline, 2 more women submitted applications to remain. One had received a letter from Germany informing her that her husband had been killed in the final weeks of the war. Returning meant being a young widow in a destroyed country with no family support. The other simply couldn't face going back to a place where she would be forever marked as someone who had served the regime, who had been captured and therefore failed, who represented shame rather than the fresh start that Canada seemed to offer. The final count was 13 choosing to stay, 19 choosing to return home. Captain Brennan filed her report with military command, noting that this unprecedented situation required unprecedented solutions. She argued that allowing these women to remain and integrate into Canadian society demonstrated the country's commitment to humanitarian values and its capacity for forgiveness without forgetting. She didn't know if her arguments would succeed, only that she felt morally obligated to make them on behalf of women who had shown remarkable courage in choosing uncertain futures over familiar devastation. The approval came through on January 12th, just 3 days before the scheduled repatriation transport. The 13 women who had applied to remain would be granted displaced person status and transferred to immigration processing. They would no longer be prisoners of war, but would become applicants for permanent residency, a status that carried both opportunity and uncertainty. The 19 women preparing for repatriation received the news with complicated reactions: relief that they wouldn't be forced to watch their companions stay while they left, and lingering doubt about their own choices. The final days before separation were emotionally charged. Women who had lived together for months, who had supported each other through the revelations about their country's crimes and the losses of their families, now prepared to permanently part ways. They exchanged addresses, promises to write, small possessions that had acquired sentimental value during their shared captivity. Lisa gave her precious photograph to one of the returning women, asking her to try to visit the cemetery in Hamburg where her family was buried and leave flowers if possible. The morning of January 15th arrived gray and cold. The 19 women boarding the transport to begin their journey back to Germany assembled in the compound yard with their meager belongings. They wore a mixture of military-issue clothing and donated civilian items, looking like what they were, displaced persons caught between identities and uncertain futures. Captain Brennan addressed them formally, thanking them for their cooperation during their imprisonment and wishing them strength for the challenges ahead. But it was Lise who spoke for those remaining, her English now fluent enough to express complex emotions. "You carry home with you," she told the departing women in German, "not the Germany that committed crimes, but the Germany of our mothers and grandmothers, of songs and traditions that belong to all of us, regardless of where we live. Please remember that some of us stayed, not because we stopped being German, but because we're trying to learn what it means to be German in a new way." The women embraced, tears flowing freely on both sides. Then the transport pulled away, carrying 19 women toward ships that would take them across an ocean to a homeland, most of them barely recognized from descriptions in letters. Those remaining watched until the vehicle disappeared, then turned back toward the compound that would house them for a few more weeks while immigration processing was completed, while they transitioned from prisoners to applicants to, hopefully, residents of a country that had been their enemy but might become their home. Mrs. Baumann arrived that afternoon to begin helping Lise prepare for the transition. They sat in the compound's common area, reviewing paperwork and discussing practical matters: how to open a bank account, where to register for English classes, what documentation she would need for employment applications. But underneath the logistics ran deeper currents about identity and belonging, about what it meant to choose a future that required abandoning a past, about whether redemption was possible for those who served evil regimes even unknowingly. October 1965. Lise stood at the entrance to Victoria Park, watching crowds stream toward the Oktoberfest celebration that had grown dramatically since that first tentative visit 20 years earlier. She was 44 now, a Canadian citizen for 15 years, a translator for the provincial government, and a mother of 2 children who spoke English as their first language but learned German songs from her in the evenings. Her life had turned out better than she had dared hope during those uncertain months in the compound, but success hadn't erased the complexity of her identity. Beside her stood her daughter Anna, named after no one in particular, but carrying a name that felt both German and universal. Anna was 16, curious about her mother's past, but struggling to understand what it meant to be the daughter of a former enemy prisoner. "Tell me again why you stayed," Anna asked, a question she had posed dozens of times over the years, always seeking new layers of understanding as she matured. Lise considered her answer carefully, as she always did. Because going back meant returning to ghosts and guilt. Staying meant building something new from broken pieces, not forgetting where I came from, but choosing where I was going. It was the most honest answer she could give, though it never felt entirely adequate to capture the moral complexity of that choice, the ways it had been simultaneously necessary and cowardly, practical and painful. They walked into the festival together, past booths selling German pastries and crafts, past the main pavilion where bands played the same folk songs that had moved Lise to tears 20 years earlier. The celebration had evolved. It now attracted not just German Canadians, but people from throughout the region who came for the food and music and communal atmosphere. The cultural specificity had been diluted somewhat, but Lise found she didn't mind. Identity could be shared without being diminished. Hetty found them near the beer garden, her face showing the years but her eyes still sharp with intelligence. She had become a respected nurse at the regional hospital, had married a Canadian doctor, and had dedicated herself to medical work with the intensity of someone trying to balance old debts through new service. They embraced speaking German by habit before switching to English when Anna looked confused by the rapid conversation. "Trudy sent a letter," Hetty said. "She's planning to visit from Toronto next month. Says she has news." The three of them, Lisa, Hetty, and Trudy, had maintained close friendship despite geographical separation, bound by shared history that no one else could fully understand. They wrote monthly, visited when possible, and held each other accountable for remembering where they came from while building who they were becoming. The band began playing Die Gedanken sind frei, the same song about freedom of thought that Lise had heard at that first Oktoberfest. This time she sang along without hesitation, her voice joining hundreds of others in a celebration of German culture that existed independently of German soil or German politics. Anna listened to her mother sing, seeing something in her face that suggested depths of experience the girl was only beginning to comprehend. The music connected past and present, loss and survival, memory and hope, in ways that transcended the simple words of the folk song itself. The festival continued around them, but Lise found herself thinking about the women who had chosen differently that January morning 20 years ago. She had maintained correspondence with three of them, letters that arrived sporadically from Germany, describing lives rebuilt slowly and painfully in a country that had been transformed by occupation, reconstruction, and the weight of historical reckoning. They had survived, even thrived in some cases, finding ways to contribute to Germany's difficult process of confronting its past while building a different future. One of those women, Greta, had become a teacher in Munich, educating a new generation about the dangers of nationalism and hatred. Another worked with refugees, helping displaced persons navigate the same kind of uncertainty she had experienced. They had chosen to face Germany's crimes directly, to participate in the reconstruction not just of buildings but of moral consciousness. Their path had been harder than Lisa's in many ways, requiring them to live daily with the physical reminders of destruction and the social complexity of being German in post-war Germany. Lise sometimes wondered if she had taken the easier path by staying in Canada, whether her choice had been driven more by fear than principle. But then she looked at her children, at the life she had built, at the small ways she had contributed to Canadian society through her work and her example. She had shown that former enemies could become productive citizens, that redemption was possible through actions rather than just words, that heritage could be honored without nationalism, that being German could mean something different than it had meant during the war years. Mrs. Baumann, now elderly and walking with difficulty, joined their group. She had sponsored Lisa's immigration and had become like a second mother, providing guidance and support through all the difficult transitions. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, a statement she had made before but which never lost its power. Lise embraced her, feeling the weight of gratitude for this woman who had seen potential rather than enemy nationality, who had offered a second chance when second chances seemed impossible. As the sun set over Victoria Park, casting golden light over the celebration, Lise thought about the leather diary she had carried from the compound, now stored in a box in her attic alongside other remnants of her past. She had stopped writing in it years ago, having found that living the questions was more important than recording them. Who was she? A German Canadian? A former prisoner? A mother? A translator? A survivor? All of these and none of these entirely. The band played one final song, a traditional farewell melody that marked the evening's end. Lisa sang with her daughter beside her, with Heidi and Mrs. Baumann and hundreds of others whose stories intersected with German culture in countless different ways. The music rose into the autumn air, carrying with it all the complexity of identity and belonging, of loss and survival, of the choices people make when faced with impossible circumstances. She had chosen to stay 20 years ago, and every day since she had chosen again through her actions to make that decision meaningful. The song ended, but its echoes continued, a reminder that some melodies transcend borders and persist across generations, belonging to everyone who chooses to sing them.